Hi guys, perhaps you're listening to this story in a quiet room. Maybe it's nighttime. Maybe it's a very ordinary moment in your modern world. But if we step back far enough, not a few centuries, not a few thousand years, but 1,000,000 years, no such room existed. Back then, there were already humans. But they did not know they were human. They had no name for themselves, no calendar, no recorded memory. They did not know they were part of evolution, and they could not possibly know that one day someone would sit in the darkness listening to a story about them. 1,000,000 years ago, humans did not ask, "Where did we come from?" They woke up not because the sun was beautiful, not because the day held plans or purpose, but because of the cold, because of a strange sound, because hunger had begun knocking on the body. There were no long-term plans, no tomorrow that was guaranteed, no world designed for them. There was only a vast earth moving according to its own rhythm, and humans, small, quiet, trying to find a place to stand within that flow. Tonight we will not look at that world from above, not from maps, not from textbooks. We will begin with the humans themselves, with their bodies, with how they ate, how they slept, how they lived together, and with the repeated habits that quietly laid the foundation for everything we now call humanity. Let this story move slowly. There is no need to memorize it, no need to compare. Just listen, because before humans knew who they were, they first had to learn how to survive. 1,000,000 years ago, there was no moment marked as a beginning. There was no day when a creature stood upright on the savannah, looked down at its hands, and realized that from that instant on, it had become human. 1,000,000 years ago, existence was not divided into clear stages. There were no names, no awareness of species, no questions about origins. There were only bodies that breathed, that moved, and that tried to extend life by one more day in a world that did not care whether they existed or not. From today's perspective, we may call them ancient humans. We can place them on an evolutionary diagram and say they came from early human branches in Africa, that they carried within them the results of millions of years of natural selection. But if we stood at that moment in time, none of them knew this. No one knew that walking upright was something rare. No one knew that the gradually enlarging brain would open up such a long future. They did not experience themselves as coming from somewhere. They were simply here. And being here was already a challenge large enough. In reality, the appearance of humans around 1,000,000 years ago was not a sudden leap, but the result of an extremely slow sequence of changes stretching back millions of years before. From distant ancestors that still carried many traits of tree-dwelling primates, the evolutionary path gradually tilted toward the ground. Upright walking did not emerge because it was advanced, but because it was useful. Standing upright helped the body dissipate heat more efficiently under the African sun, allowed individuals to see farther across tall grass, and most importantly, freed the hands. Those hands at first, used only to carry food, hold infants, or grasp objects, simply gradually became an intermediary between a fragile body and an increasingly harsh environment. Long before the 1,000,000-year mark, earlier, human forms such as the Australopithecines had laid the first stones on this path. They had not fully left the trees and still bore the marks of hesitation between two worlds. Yet it was precisely this imperfection that opened the way for later human forms. As Africa's climate grew drier, forests shrank and gave way to wide savannas, individuals better adapted to moving on the ground gained an advantage. Not because they were stronger, but because they happened to be suited to the moment. By more than 2 million years ago, human forms such as Homo habilis appeared with slightly larger brains and the ability to make simple stone tools. These were not inventors, but organisms learning to extend the capabilities of their bodies through external objects. Those crude stone tools allowed access to food that had previously been unreachable: bone marrow scraps of meat left on large carcasses, hard roots. Each small advantage was paid for through countless trials and errors, and only those who survived carried the evolutionary line forward. Around 1 million years ago, the central figure of this story was Homo erectus. These were humans with bodies very close to our own fully upright posture, tall and lean frames, long legs suited for endurance movement. Their brains were significantly larger than those of earlier human forms, not enough for abstract thought, but enough to remember to learn and to coordinate within groups. More importantly, they were the first humans capable of leaving Africa in a stable way, expanding their range into other parts of Eurasia. Yet from within their own lived experience, the concept of evolution did not exist. There was no awareness that they differed from their ancestors. Each generation was born inheriting a body only slightly different from the one before it, a bit taller with less hair, a slightly larger head. These changes were too subtle to inspire amazement. They unfolded so slowly as to be invisible. No one looked at their child and thought, "This one is more advanced than I am." Only one thing was recognized clearly: a child that could not adapt did not grow up. Evolution at that time was not a story of progress. It was a continuous filtering process. The environment did not reward the smartest, but the most fitting. A body that tolerated heat better a brain that remembered water routes more accurately. A group that bonded more effectively in danger. These small factors accumulated and determined who continued to exist. There was no final goal, no destination. Only the extension of life by one more generation. For this reason, saying that humans 1 million years ago appeared can be misleading. They did not appear as a new species stepping onto a stage. They were a temporary result of a flow that never stopped. They stood in between not the half-tree, half-ground creatures of the past, but not yet the humans who told stories, asked questions about the universe or about themselves. They existed in a long pause of evolution where the body ran far ahead of consciousness. And precisely because they did not know who they were or where they came from, every action they took was tightly bound to the present. They carried no burden of the past and no longing for a distant future. They had only a body inherited from millions of years of experimentation and a world always ready to eliminate anyone who failed to keep up. In that context, being here continuing to exist for one more day, one more season, was the greatest achievement evolution could produce. Being here meant waking while the air was still heavy with mist, not because there was a plan for the day, but because the cold had crept into the flesh. Being here meant opening one's eyes in a world with no clear boundaries of safety, where every unfamiliar sound could signal danger. Being here meant experiencing hunger as a familiar state rather than an abnormal event. Life at that time was not measured in years or accomplishments, but in the number of sunrises and sunsets the body endured intact. The body of humans 1 million years ago bore clear marks of adaptation, but not adaptation towards strength or speed. They were not made to stand still, nor to launch into short bursts of explosive motion. Everything in their structure pointed toward a different ability endurance. Legs longer relative to the torso, strong and stable hip joints, a spine flexible enough to maintain balance over many hours of continuous movement. Shoulders and rib cage allowed the arms to swing freely, not only to maintain rhythm while walking, but to carry whatever could be taken from the environment. This was a body built to walk, to keep walking, and not to collapse halfway. They were not the fastest runners on the savanna. In a short chase, they would lose to almost every large predator. They were not the strongest either. Their muscles did not allow for direct confrontation. They had no sharp fangs to tear flesh, no claws to hold prey. But they possessed a quiet, almost invisible advantage, the ability to sustain movement for very long periods. While many other animals were forced to stop, gasp for breath, or retreat when energy ran out, humans continued moving. Not fast, but steady. Not loudly, but relentlessly. In a world where food did not wait in fixed places and water sources were unstable, this ability was a matter of survival. Staying too long in one area meant exhausting what could be gathered and becoming familiar in the eyes of predators. Movement was not a strategic choice. It was a natural reflex. When signs of depletion appeared, fewer fruits, more predator tracks, water that smelled faint bodies were already prepared to leave. No debate, no long-term planning, just the next step forward. For that reason, there was no concept of home in a lasting sense. No place was built to remain forever. There were only temporary stopping points remembered, not because they were familiar, but because they once allowed survival. A tree that had blocked the wind on a cold night. A riverbank that had provided water during a dry season. A rock outcrop that offered a vantage point far enough to detect danger. These places were not named or marked, yet they were stored clearly in memory. And when needed, bodies would automatically find their way back, as if the land itself had etched invisible roots. The brain of humans 1 million years ago clearly reflected this way of life. Though smaller than the modern human brain, it was already complex enough to perform a crucial function, remembering what directly related to survival. It did not tell stories. It did not create myths. It did not ask questions about the future or the meaning of existence, but it remembered precisely and without mercy. It remembered paths to water when the ground cracked with drought. It remembered the smell of wind carrying signs of predators. It remembered places where danger had occurred to avoid repeating mistakes. Each memory was kept not because it was interesting, but because it had once saved a life. These memories did not reside solely in the head of a single individual. They spread through the group by very rudimentary means, a gaze lingering longer in a certain direction, a brief sound made upon noticing something unusual, a hand gesture signaling stop, crouch, or turn aside. There were no words to explain, yet there was enough shared understanding for the group to react almost simultaneously. This coordination did not come from rules or commands, but from repeated experience. Over time, effective reactions were retained, while faulty ones vanished, along with individuals who did not survive. Within this silence, a form of collective intelligence began to take shape. No one possessed the whole of it, but each individual held a fragment. One remembered terrain well. Another was sensitive to sound. Another could detect movement at a distance. Moving together, these scattered memories combined into a living map, not drawn on land or stone, but existing in the group's shared presence. This knowledge was not stored. It was activated when needed and existed only as long as the group existed. This brain was also not capable of imagining a distant future. There was no concept of years ahead, let alone generations to come. But it was enough to recognize short chains of cause and effect. Stay here, and danger increases. Leave, and there is a chance to live. Decisions were not based on long-term prediction, but on a keen sense of whether the present was worsening or improving. In that world, survival was not victory, it was simply not losing yet. Notably, this adaptation bore no trace of conscious progress. No one thought their body was special. No one compared themselves to other species to recognize advantages. Changes happened so slowly that they could not be noticed within a single lifetime. Each generation carried a version almost identical to the last, altered just enough to be more or less suitable to specific conditions. If suitable, they lived longer. If not, they disappeared. There was no recognition, no named failure, only the final outcome expressed as presence or absence. In that context, body and brain were not separate entities. They functioned as a single system tuned to respond to the environment rather than to reflect upon it. The body set the limits, how far one could walk, how much cold could be endured, how long hunger could be tolerated. The brain handled the rest, deciding when to move, when to stop, when to avoid. There was little distance between sensation and action. When danger appeared, reaction came before thought. And this seamlessness allowed humans to survive in a world that did not permit hesitation. Thus, when we say that humans 1 million years ago bore the marks of adaptation, we are not speaking only of posture, limb proportions, or the gradual enlargement of the brain. We are speaking of a deeper alignment of an entire organism shaped around one overriding task, staying alive in a world that refused to stay still. Their body's senses and mental habits were not optimized for comfort reflection or mastery of the environment. They were optimized for responsiveness. There was no need to know where they had come from because the past offered no protection. There was no need to know where they were going because the future could not be secured. The only knowledge that mattered was immediate and practical: when to stay, when to leave, what to remember, what to avoid. Memory did not exist to preserve identity or history. It existed to prevent repetition of fatal errors. A dry riverbed remembered too late a place where predators once waited a route that led nowhere. These were lessons paid for with lives, and therefore never forgotten. In such a world, adaptation was not a destination, but a constant state. To survive meant remaining slightly unfinished, slightly adjustable. A body that could walk far rather than strike fast. A mind that could store patterns rather than theories. A group that could dissolve and reform without collapsing. This was adaptation at its most refined, not dominance, but timely withdrawal. Not certainty, but situational awareness. The highest achievement was not victory, but continuity, making it through one more cycle of heat and cold scarcity and brief abundance. Stone tools emerged within this logic. They were not symbols of creativity or markers of intelligence-seeking expression. They were accelerators. A sharp edge meant less time spent exposed. A heavier stone meant quicker access to marrow before competitors arrived. A tool was valuable not because it lasted, but because it saved minutes and minutes at a carcass or a root bed, could mean the difference between leaving nourished or leaving empty-handed. Every approach to a large food source was a negotiation with danger. The smell of blood traveled far. The sound of cracking bone carried. Other species stronger, faster, more heavily armed, were always nearby, watching, waiting. Humans could not afford to linger. They could not afford to claim ownership. They could not afford to eat slowly. The goal was never to consume everything, but to take enough quickly and disappear before attention sharpened. Eating, therefore, was stripped of ceremony. It was not about taste, not about togetherness, not about satisfaction. It was about timing. a narrow opening in which calories could be converted into movement warmth, and another day of endurance. To miss that opening was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence of prolonged hunger, with consequences that might echo for weeks. Seen this way, stone tools were not the beginning of culture, but the continuation of physiology by other means. They extended hands already freed by upright walking. They complemented bodies already tuned for persistence. They fit seamlessly into a life where speed of action mattered more than elegance, and effectiveness mattered more than permanence. In that world, nothing was built to last, not shelters, not tools, not even groups. What lasted was the capacity to respond, to abandon what no longer worked, and to carry forward only what had proven its worth. This more than any anatomical trait was the true pinnacle of adaptation. 1 million years ago, a way of living so tightly bound to reality that it required no explanation, no justification, and no name. When the sun set, the world changed completely. The night of 1 million years ago had no artificial light, no safe distance between humans and the rest of nature. Vision faded quickly while hearing strained to catch the smallest sounds. Sleep in this context was not total surrender. It was a lowered state of alertness, but never safety. They slept in groups pressed close together, not for affection or intimacy, but for warmth and for more ears listening. Sleep came in short fragments, easily broken, easily interrupted. Night was not a time of full rest. It was a dangerous gap that humans had to cross again and again until daylight returned. The human body, though adapted for movement, remained fragile against the environment. Bare skin was vulnerable to sun-wind insects and abrasion, and so the first things worn had no fixed shape. There was no concept of clothing, no sizes, no tailoring. Only animal hides thrown over shoulders, wrapped around bodies, removed when unnecessary. Not for beauty, not for distinction, but to extend the body's tolerance a little longer. At that time, wearing was simply protection, not yet a cultural expression. They did not live alone, yet they had not formed society in the modern sense. Their groups were small, flexible, and responsive to circumstance. There were no fixed roles, no permanent leaders. The strong moved ahead. The weak were protected in the middle. Those who remembered roots were followed. Everything operated through continuous observation and constant adjustment. Children were not taught with words. They learned by watching, imitating, repeating what adults did. Survival knowledge passed on silently and efficiently without classrooms or written rules. 1 million years ago, there were no customs in the sense of rituals or beliefs, no symbols, no named gods. But there was repetition. Food was shared because not sharing led to exclusion. The injured were stayed with because abandonment reduced the survival chances of the whole group. Familiar places were revisited because spatial memory was more reliable than risk. These actions were not explained or celebrated. They simply persisted because they worked. And from these nameless repetitions, the seeds of custom of survival ethics began to form. Those humans did not know they stood at a long evolutionary crossroads. They did not know that small choices, seemingly instinctive, would shape hundreds of thousands of years to come. They did not know there would be complex language cities written history. They did not know that one day someone would sit in the darkness of a very different world, listening to a story about them. They knew only one thing simple and unforgiving. If they did not adapt, they would vanish. And within that not knowing, within those unrecorded days of survival, human history began. Not with a declaration, not with a symbolic invention, but with a chain of days connected to one another. The next chapter will not speak of glory or great leaps. It will speak of limits of living in a world where nowhere is truly safe. But before moving on, let this moment settle. 1 million years ago, humans did not know who they were, yet they were resilient enough that you can be here now, listening to this story in the night. The body of humans 1 million years ago was not a perfect product, nor the result of any purposeful design. It was a compromise stretched across countless generations between what the environment demanded and what the body was capable of providing. But if there was one trait that stood out above all others, it was this: they were not made to remain still. Everything in that form pointed toward movement. Not explosive movement, not a sudden burst, but movement that was durable, extended, almost unceasing. Their legs were longer relative to the upper body, not to run faster in a moment, but to distribute force more evenly over long periods. Each step did not concentrate the full body weight onto a single point. It spread through the knee, the hip, and then up the spine along an axis that evolution had aligned. The knee was not merely a hinge for bending and straightening. It was a load-bearing structure built to repeat the same motion tens of thousands of times without collapsing. The hip broad and stable prevented the upper body from tipping forward while moving, creating an energy-saving gait as efficient as possible under natural conditions. Their feet were a small detail with enormous significance, not because they looked impressive, but because they solved a quiet, relentless problem: how to move again and again without breaking oneself. No longer a flat surface meant for gripping branches, the human foot had gradually transformed into a complex structure built for contact with the ground. The development of a clear arch was not an aesthetic change. It was a mechanical one. That arch acted as a biological spring, storing and releasing energy with every step. When the foot struck the earth, the arch compressed, slightly dispersing impact forces that would otherwise shoot straight up through bone and joint. When the foot lifted again, that stored energy was released, assisting the next step with minimal additional effort. This meant that walking was no longer a constant act of collision. It became a controlled exchange between body and ground. Shock waves were softened before they reached the ankle, the knee, the hip, the spine, and ultimately the skull. Over thousands, tens of thousands of steps, this mattered enormously. Tiny reductions in impact, repeated endlessly, translated into fewer micro-injuries, less joint degradation, and a body that could continue functioning day after day without catastrophic failure. The foot also changed how weight was distributed. Instead of a single point of pressure force spread across heel arch and forefoot in sequence, this rolling motion reduced stress concentration and allowed for smoother transitions between steps. Walking became less about forceful propulsion and more about managed momentum. The body learned to fall forward in a controlled way, catching itself again and again without panic, without collapse. Importantly, this structure was not designed to make humans fast. A cheetah's foot is built for explosive acceleration. A deer's hoof is built for spring and speed. The human foot sacrificed raw velocity in exchange for reliability. It favored endurance over performance consistency, over spectacle. It was a foot meant to survive repetition. In a world without medicine, without surgery, without rest periods designed for recovery, this distinction was critical. Injuries did not heal cleanly. Chronic damage accumulated. A cracked bone, an inflamed joint, a damaged spine could end a life not immediately, but inevitably by slowing movement, reducing range, increasing vulnerability. Under such conditions, avoiding damage was more valuable than gaining advantage. The arched foot, therefore, represents a philosophy written into anatomy. It is better to arrive later than not arrive at all. Better to move slowly than to move briefly. Better to preserve the body than to spend it. This design also reflects a deeper shift in how humans interacted with the landscape. The ground was no longer something to avoid except when necessary. It became a constant partner. The foot learned to read terrain, soft soil, hard stone, uneven ground, and adjust subtly with each step. Muscles, tendons, and ligaments worked together to fine-tune balance in real time, reducing the risk of sudden failure. Walking became not just movement, but continuous negotiation. Seen this way, the human foot was not merely a body part. It was a long-term survival strategy. It allowed humans to cross distances that were not impressive in a sprint, but extraordinary over days and weeks. It made migration possible before migration was a concept. It supported a life defined not by bursts of success, but by the ability to keep going. In that world where the body could not be repaired and mistakes echoed forward without mercy, not destroying oneself mattered far more than being faster for a few fleeting seconds. The arch of the foot was a quiet answer to that reality, one that asked for patience, endurance, and time, and repaid those qualities with survival. Their spine no longer lay horizontally as in other primates, nor was it simply a rigid, upright pillar. It had just enough curvature to maintain balance and just enough flexibility to absorb oscillation during movement. When standing upright, body weight was distributed evenly onto two legs rather than unevenly as in four-legged locomotion. This allowed humans to maintain posture for long periods without constantly adjusting through muscular effort. When we look at that skeleton, we do not see signs of exceptional strength or explosive capacity. Instead, we see a different priority, very clearly long-term stability. This was a body refined to endure, to repeat a single behavior, walking for hours, even days, without collapsing the very structure that supported it. Their shoulders and rib cage told the same story of quiet adaptation. The shoulder was not locked in place as it is in climbing animals, where the joint must continuously bear pulling and gripping forces. Instead, the shoulder became more flexible in a front-back direction, allowing the arms to swing naturally with each step. This seemingly small movement helped balance the body while walking upright, reduced twisting forces on the upper torso, and most importantly, saved energy. Each swinging arm served as a counterweight, making the gait smoother and less costly. Their rib cage was neither overly wide nor tightly compressed like that of animals built for sudden bursts of power. It left enough space for the lungs to work efficiently over long durations, supporting steady breathing during continuous travel. Their breath was not frantic or rapid like sprinting breath. It was deep, slow, and rhythmic. This breathing pattern provided a stable oxygen supply to the muscles, preventing fatigue from building too quickly. On a long journey, the ability to sustain breathing mattered far more than the ability to explode in the first few moments. All of these elements combined to create a very particular kind of body. This was not the body of a predator that strikes in an instant, nor the body of a creature that wins through direct physical confrontation. This was the body of a being that could follow a trail for a long time, a being that could continue moving when other animals were forced to stop. In the heat of the savannah, when many creatures had to seek shade to avoid exhaustion, humans could still keep going slowly but without stopping. And it was precisely this slow but unceasing quality that opened opportunities that strength or speed alone could never provide. What matters is that none of these traits appeared all at once, and none of them were recognized as a clear advantage. No one among them understood that an arched foot or an upright spine was helping them survive. These traits simply existed, preserved across generations, in which bodies endured the environment more effectively. Individuals who were less suited would tire sooner, suffer injury faster, and gradually disappear from the evolutionary flow. Those who remained kept walking, carrying a body increasingly suited to continuing onward. So, when we say that humans 1 million years ago possessed a body optimized for movement, that does not mean they were born to conquer space. They were born to avoid the death that comes from staying in place. In a world where resources were not fixed and danger was always near, the ability to leave at the right time on one's own legs was the only guarantee of survival. And the entire structure of that body, from the feet, knees, and hips to the spine, shoulders, and rib cage, quietly served that single purpose: to keep walking when staying was no longer safe. They were not the fastest species. In a short chase, humans would lose to nearly all large predators. A hyena could accelerate within seconds. A cheetah could end a hunt with a single precise burst. A lion, if necessary, could use sheer muscular power to overwhelm completely. Against such capabilities, humans 1 million years ago had almost no chance of winning if they played by the same rules. They were not the strongest either. Their muscles were not designed to bring down prey in an instant. They had no sharp fangs to bite deep and hold, no claws to pin an opponent to the ground. In direct confrontation, humans were almost always at a disadvantage. A small mistake, a misstep, a slip, and the price could be a life. In a world with no medicine, no post-injury care, severe injury almost always meant being removed from the game. Precisely because they lacked such obvious advantages, humans were forced to step outside the usual logic of pursuit and confrontation. They did not compete through speed. They did not compete through strength. Instead, they competed through time. This was a strategy that was not loud, not spectacular, and not easy to notice in the moment. But over the long run, it proved extraordinarily effective. In a world where energy was the most precious resource, every creature paid a cost for each burst of exertion. Running fast consumes enormous energy. Fighting directly consumes even more energy and carries the additional risk of injury. Most predators, therefore, can sustain only short attacks. If they do not succeed quickly, they must give up, withdraw, and preserve strength for the next hunt. That endurance advantage was especially meaningful in the environment they inhabited. 1 million years ago, food and water did not remain in one place. Water sources could dry up seasonally, herds moved along shifting routes, vegetation changed with climate. Staying too long in one area meant exhausting what could be gathered and becoming predictable to other predators. In such a context, movement was not a carefully weighed strategic choice. It was a reflex. When signs of depletion appeared, the body was already ready to leave before consciousness could even form a question. So the concept of home, in any lasting sense, did not exist. No place was built to remain forever. There was no space protected by fences or walls. There were only temporary stopping points, patches of land remembered because survival had been possible there. A riverbank that had provided water in the dry season. A large tree that had blocked the wind on a cold night. A rocky outcrop that had offered a vantage point far enough to detect danger before it was too late. These places were not named or marked, but they existed clearly in the group's memory, like invisible knots on a living map. Movement, therefore, did not mean exploration or adventure. It was the only way to avoid the death that comes from familiarity. Staying too long made resources scarce and danger greater, but moving also carried risk. Every step into new land could lead to water or into a deadly trap. Humans 1 million years ago had no maps, no concept of vast territories. They had only short-term memory and experience built through trial and error. And it was their enduring bodies that allowed them to attempt those trials more times without collapsing immediately. That body also reflected a particular relationship between humans and temperature. Standing upright reduced the surface area exposed directly to the sun while increasing cooling through wind. Sweating, though it caused the body to lose water faster, allowed stable temperature regulation during long movement. This was not an advantage for victory, it was an advantage for endurance. In the heat of the savannah, being able to keep moving while other animals were forced to stop created ecological openings that humans could exploit. But the body never operated alone. It was always linked with the brain and nervous system, forming a continuous feedback loop. The body sensed fatigue, thirst, hunger. The brain interpreted those signals not in words, but as urges to act, slow down, turn, seek shade, or keep going just a little longer. There was no clear separation between sensation and decision. In that world, hesitation could be fatal. And so, quick reflexes and constant adjustment became the key. This enduring movement also shaped how humans lived together. The group could not be too large because a large group would move slowly and struggle to find enough food. But it could not be too small either, because the risk of facing danger would increase. Group size therefore hovered in a fragile balance, shifting with environmental conditions. When food was abundant, the group could be larger. When scarcity came, the group split each part, carrying shared memories and experience into its own path. Along the way, individual bodies were not all the same. Some tolerated heat better, others tolerated cold better. Some walked faster, others were more enduring. These differences were not judged in words, but recognized clearly through action: who could move at the front, who should remain in the middle, who needed protection through dangerous terrain. Roles were not fixed. They changed with each segment of the journey. The body, not a title, determined each person's place in that moment. What is striking is that this adaptation did not resemble a long-term goal. None of them thought their bodies were evolving for the sake of the future. Each generation inherited a version extremely close to the generation before it. Changes happened so slowly that they could not be seen in a single lifetime. But over hundreds of thousands of years, those small adjustments produced a distinctive kind of body. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but flexible enough to persist across many different environments. That body also imposed clear limits. They could not endure prolonged cold like ice-adapted animals. They could not climb with the agility of tree-dwelling primates. They could not hunt alone like apex predators. So, movement was not only a strategy, it was also a way of avoiding their own limitations. When the environment became too cold, they left. When forests became too dense, they found other routes. When open grassland became too dangerous, they traveled along the edges where hiding was possible. Within that flow, the human body became the primary tool for interacting with the world. There were no vehicles, no complex intermediaries. Each step left a trace, but those traces were quickly erased by wind, rain, and time. Only movement continued, and it was that continuity that kept humans alive even though they did not understand why they had to keep going and did not know where they were going. So, when we look back from the present, we can call the human body of 1 million years ago a body made for movement. But to them, it was not a trait to be proud of or even to recognize. It was simply the only way to live. When staying became dangerous, they walked. When walking too long, exhausted the body, they stopped. in the safest temporary place they could find. There was no plan B, no alternative choice, only a chain of short decisions, one after another, guided by a body that could endure and by an environment that would not allow stillness. The next chapter will go deeper into the brain operating inside that body, a brain not yet built for storytelling, not yet built to create meaning, but already sophisticated enough to remember to coordinate and to form the earliest seeds of collective intelligence. The body could carry humans very far, but it could not decide the direction. After hours, after days of movement, the legs could keep stepping, the lungs could keep breathing, the muscles could keep enduring, but that alone was not enough. Even a resilient body could lead humans straight into danger if there was nothing to tell them when to move on, when to stop, and when to avoid a place entirely. Staying too long could lead to depletion. Leaving too early could mean missing a chance to survive. Moving in the wrong direction could mean never returning at all. That is why behind a body made for walking, there was a brain made for remembering. Not to recount the journey, not to understand its meaning, but to retain the smallest signs that had once marked the boundary between safety and death. That brain, silent, wordless, tightly bound to every step, began to assume the role of guiding the body's endurance. And from here, the story is no longer only about how far humans could go, but about how they knew how to move in a world that never offered clear answers. The brain of humans 1 million years ago was not the brain of storytellers. It was not born to create myths, to imagine a distant future, or to ask questions about the meaning of existence. The brain regions responsible for high-level abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, or long-form narrative, those used by modern humans to build religion, philosophy, and history, had not yet taken on a central role. But if we look more closely, it was a brain extraordinarily precise in one single task, remembering in order to survive. In a world where mistakes could not be corrected and opportunities rarely repeated, memory mattered far more than imagination. Studies of skulls and endocasts of Homo erectus show that their average brain volume was around 850 to 1,000 cubic centimeters, significantly smaller than that of modern humans. However, anthropologists have long warned that judging intelligence based solely on brain size is a mistake. What matters more is how the brain is organized and which functions are prioritized. Regions associated with sensation movement, spatial orientation, and associative memory were relatively well developed, while the prefrontal cortex linked to long-term planning and abstract thought had not yet become dominant as it is today. Morphological analyses of fossil skulls suggest that the brains of humans at this time were optimized for processing information from the surrounding environment. Signals such as terrain, sound, smell, and subtle spatial changes were rapidly received and linked to prior experience. Researchers describe this as a form of ecological memory, a type of memory inseparable from the living environment. The brain did not store abstract facts. It stored relationships. This place is linked to danger. That direction is linked to water. This time of year is linked to scarcity. Some comparative studies between ancient human brains and those of modern primates show that despite lacking complex language, early human brains were highly effective at processing sensory motor information. This was especially important in the context of constant movement. The brain had to coordinate walking rhythm, balance, breathing, and environmental observation simultaneously while maintaining a high level of alertness. This was a form of survival multitasking, not directed by verbal thought, but by neural circuits refined through natural selection. Scientists have also observed that brain development at this stage was closely tied to tool use and long-distance movement. Making and using stone tools did not require high-level abstract reasoning, but it did require the ability to remember sequences of actions, apply appropriate force, and understand the relationship between material and outcome. The brain of humans 1 million years ago was capable of retaining such action sequences, even though it could not yet articulate them as knowledge in the modern sense. This shows that a brain does not need to tell stories in order to function effectively. It only needs to operate correctly in the right context. Notably, this brain was oriented not toward explaining the world, but toward responding accurately to it. It did not ask, "Why did this happen?" It recorded, "This happened, and this was the consequence." In a constantly changing environment where climate, animals, and food sources were unstable, such a brain had a clear advantage. Individuals who spent too much energy on reflection or behavior unrelated to survival would quickly be filtered out. Those whose brains focused on memory and effective response survived longer. Some modern neurological models even suggest that the brains of humans at this time operated according to principles of maximum energy efficiency. The brain is an energetically expensive organ, so functions that did not directly serve survival had little opportunity to develop strongly. The absence of abstract thought was not a deficiency, but an adaptive strategy. The brain retained only what was most necessary to continue existing under harsh conditions. Thus, when we say that the brain of humans 1 million years ago did not dream, this does not imply simplicity or underdevelopment. It was a highly precise brain, refined to process exactly the kind of information needed at exactly the right time. It did not tell stories about the distant past or construct visions of the far future, but it retained life-critical signals with great fidelity. In a world where a single wrong decision could end a lineage, this brain did not need imagination, it needed memory. And that priority laid the neural foundation for humanity's continued existence, even though humans themselves had no idea they were walking along such a long evolutionary path. Their memory was tightly bound to space. They did not remember events in chronological sequence or arrange them into stories with beginnings and endings. Instead, memory was anchored to place. A bend in the river where water dried quickly at the end of the dry season. A path where predators had once ambushed prey. A low-lying area where cold mist lingered longer at night. These places were not named, not marked with symbols, but existed clearly in the brain as bright and dark points on an invisible map. As humans moved, the brain continuously compared the present moment with stored memory patterns. Does this wind smell familiar? Has that sound ever signaled danger? Does the terrain ahead resemble a place where a mistake once occurred? Each step was accompanied by such silent comparisons. There was no extended reasoning, only a feeling of continue or avoid. In that world, intuition was not mysterious. It was the result of thousands of remembered eliminations and reinforcements. Crucially, this memory did not exist only at the individual level. It spread through the group in very simple but effective ways. One person stopped suddenly. Another changed direction without explanation. The entire group followed not because of an order, but because such behavior had previously been linked to survival. Language was not required to transmit the full memory. Repeating the correct action in the correct context was enough to activate memory in others. The brain therefore functioned as part of a larger network. No one in the group held all the knowledge. Each individual carried only a portion, a fragment. One person was sensitive to sound, noticing subtle changes in wind or distant noise. Another was sensitive to smell, distinguishing between old and fresh predator traces. Another remembered routes, well-turned landmarks, places that had once been safe. When the group moved together, these fragments overlapped, forming a shared perceptual system that was flexible and adaptable to circumstance. This was a form of intelligence without a central controller. There was no leader issuing commands, no command brain, and decisions emerged from the convergence of many small signals. If many individuals became tense, the group slowed. If many gazes turned in one direction, attention followed. If a behavior repeatedly led to safety, it became a shared reflex. Intelligence in this context did not reside in an exceptional individual, but in the wordless coordination of the group. What this brain could not yet do was tell stories. Events were not woven into narratives with meaning. An accident that occurred yesterday did not become a lesson told verbally today. It left only a faint emotional trace, causing the group to avoid that area for a time. As memory faded, if circumstances forced a return, mistakes could be repeated. There were no legends to preserve memory beyond a single generation. All knowledge was fragile, dependent on the continued presence of those who had experienced it. For this reason, the brain of humans 1 million years ago lived entirely in an extended present. It was not pulled toward the distant past, nor oriented toward a long future. Anything beyond the last few seasons or journeys barely existed in awareness. This was not purely a limitation. In a constantly changing environment, not being bound by long-term plans could be an advantage. The group could adapt quickly when conditions shifted without having to defend outdated decisions or plans that no longer worked. This brain also processed danger very differently from how we do today. There was no concept of abstract risk. Danger existed only when it was present. When it could not be seen, heard, or smelled, the brain did not waste energy worrying. Tension rose quickly when needed, and dissipated quickly when the threat passed. This nervous system was tuned for immediate response, not prolonged rumination. In that world, excessive anxiety, when unnecessary, was itself a waste of energy. However, this type of brain also imposed clear and unavoidable limits. The absence of long-term planning meant that humans 1 million years ago had little capacity to anticipate slow, large-scale environmental shifts before those shifts became immediately threatening. Gradual changes in climate, lengthening dry seasons, shrinking water sources. The steady movement of animal populations were not recognized as parts of a larger pattern unfolding over decades or generations. They were experienced only as local crises encountered one at a time. When the environment changed faster than a group's ability to respond through short-term adjustment, the consequences could be devastating. Routes once reliable no longer led to water, familiar landscapes, no longer provided food, and learned responses suddenly failed. Without a system of generational memory capable of preserving lessons across many lifetimes, knowledge remained fragile. There were no story symbols or rituals designed to carry warnings forward in time. Each generation entered the world with only the memory embedded in its own body and the immediate guidance of those still alive. When older individuals died, entire sets of experiences vanished with them. Long cycles, droughts that returned every few decades, shifts in animal behavior that unfolded slowly had to be relearned again and again. In this sense, evolution was not a steady accumulation of wisdom, but a rhythm of gain and loss of learning, followed by forgetting. Survival did not depend on remembering everything, but on remembering enough long enough to last another generation. This limitation shaped how humans related to uncertainty. They did not prepare for distant possibilities, They reacted to present signals. The brain was not built to imagine futures that could not yet be sensed. Instead, it waited for the body to detect change, less water on the tongue, weaker strength in the limbs, unfamiliar heat, or cold on the skin. Only when the environment crossed a threshold that the body could feel did action begin. This made human responses fast and decisive, but also reactive rather than anticipatory. In a world of sudden danger, this was an advantage. In a world of slow, accumulating change, it could become a vulnerability. Crucially, this brain was inseparable from the body that carried it. Cognition was not something that happened in isolation inside the skull. It was distributed across muscles, joints, skin, lungs, and senses. Humans did not think their way through the world, they felt their way through it. Fatigue in the legs was not merely discomfort, it was information. Dryness in the throat was not an abstract signal, it was a directive. The tightening of skin in cold air, or the burning of the sun on exposed flesh, was data immediately meaningful and immediately actionable. These bodily signals were not translated into inner speech or deliberate reasoning. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options in words. When the body signaled strain, the brain responded by adjusting behavior, slowing down, changing direction, seeking shade, stopping altogether. This created a seamless loop between perception and action. The boundary between sensing and deciding was thin, almost non-existent. Response followed sensation with minimal delay. This continuity was not a weakness, it was a survival mechanism. In situations where hesitation could be fatal, where a delayed reaction to a predator, a sudden terrain change, or physical exhaustion could mean death, the absence of reflection saved lives. The brain did not pause to ask why something felt wrong. It accepted the signal and acted. Speed of adjustment mattered more than certainty of explanation. Over time, this embodied mode of cognition shaped not only individual behavior, but group dynamics as well. When several bodies simultaneously registered strain, slowing pace, growing thirst, rising tension, the group adjusted without discussion. Movement changed, direction shifted, rest was taken. Collective behavior emerged from shared bodily states rather than from explicit coordination. The group knew something was wrong because multiple bodies were saying the same thing at once. In this way, the brain's limits and strengths were deeply intertwined. Its inability to plan far ahead was balanced by its extraordinary sensitivity to the present. Its lack of abstract foresight was compensated by a refined ability to read immediate conditions through the body. Intelligence did not reside in distant vision, but in responsiveness. Survival depended not on seeing the future, but on feeling the present accurately enough to act in time. This form of cognition left little room for reflection, but it created a powerful alignment between organism and environment. Humans did not stand apart from the world to analyze it. They were embedded within it, adjusting continuously as conditions shifted. And while this made long-term preparation nearly impossible, it allowed humans to navigate a dangerous, unpredictable world with a precision that no amount of abstract planning could have provided. In this context, memory was not a static archive. It was a dynamic tool constantly updated. A place once safe could become dangerous when conditions changed. A familiar route could be abandoned if it no longer worked. The brain did not keep memories out of loyalty to the past, but because of their practical value in the present. When a memory ceased to be useful, it gradually faded, making room for new information. This kind of flexibility could only be maintained by a brain unburdened by long narrative structures. It is from here that the earliest seeds of human intelligence begin to appear, though not yet in a form familiar to us. Not the intelligence of language, but the intelligence of orientation. Not the intelligence of symbols, but the intelligence of relationships between body and environment. Not individual intelligence, but intelligence distributed across a group existing only as long as that group existed. 1 million years ago, the human brain did not tell stories, but it knew how to retain what was necessary to ensure that the human story did not end too soon. It did not create meaning, but it created continuity. And in a world where most species could vanish after only a short chain of errors, that ability, however rough and unnamed, was enough to keep humans alive. The next chapter will focus on a very specific need that this brain had to solve: everyday food, not as a cultural or ritual element, but as the force that compelled humans to keep moving, keep observing, and keep facing risk. That brain could remember routes, recognize danger, and help humans avoid repeating lethal mistakes. But memory, no matter how accurate, could not feed the body by itself. Every memory that was kept had value only as long as the legs still had the strength to keep moving. And that always returned to one very concrete question: where does the energy come from? After every stretch of travel, after every correct decision that helped them avoid harm, the body spent a portion of reserves that were already scarce. Hunger gradually became present, not as a sudden event, but as a background pressure that never disappeared. That pressure forced the brain to shift its focus from avoiding danger to searching for opportunity, from remembering where not to go to remembering where something edible might be found. And from here, survival memory was no longer only a map of risk. It became a map of food. A place was no longer remembered merely as dangerous or safe, but as worth it or not worth it. The world reorganized itself inside the mind into a sparse network of possibilities, a bend in a river where water lingered a little longer into the dry season, a cluster of trees that sometimes, only sometimes, held fruit at the right moment, a low patch of ground where tubers could be dug after rain softened the soil, a corridor along the edge of the savanna where edible plants reappeared before they did elsewhere. These were not destinations in any romantic sense. They were life support points, rare, conditional, and always temporary. To remember them was not to preserve a pleasant image, but to preserve a root out of starvation. Humans began to perceive the landscape not as continuous space, but as intervals between resources. The distance between one edible opportunity and the next became the true measure of the world. A plain was not wide, it was too long without food. A slope was not steep, it was a cost in energy that might not be repaid. A detour was not an inconvenience. It was a gamble: spend more energy now to reach a place that might feed you later. In that sense, their memory did not merely store locations, it stored exchange rates. How much movement did a place demand? How much hunger could be endured before reaching it? How much risk accumulated along the way? Every remembered site carried an invisible calculation. Energy out. Energy in with survival, resting on whether the balance stayed above zero. This is where behavior begins to tighten around necessity. Travel is no longer simply avoidance, avoiding predators, avoiding exhaustion, avoiding unfamiliar terrain. It becomes pursuit of anything that can refill what the body constantly spends. Routes become more than paths. They become strategies. A group might follow the same corridor, not because it is comfortable, but because it has repeatedly yielded enough to keep bodies moving. They might circle back to an area not because it is home, but because memory says last time we survived here, and survival is the only proof that matters. And when memory fails, when a place that once provided no longer does, the shift is immediate and unforgiving. There is no room for disappointment, only the urgent need to update the map. Cooperation, too, changes shape under this pressure. When food is the condition for continued movement, a group becomes more than shared safety. It becomes shared searching. One person's sharp eyes extend the group's vision. Another person's sensitivity to smell expands the range of detection. Someone who has previously found tubers in a certain soil becomes, in effect, a living reference point, not a leader by title, but a leader by relevance in that moment. Roles emerge and dissolve depending on what the group needs today. Cooperation is not moralized, it is practical. You stay near those who increase your chances of finding the next edible point, because the alternative is not loneliness, it is depletion, and it reshapes risk in a way that is easy to miss from a modern perspective. Risk is no longer something to avoid, absolutely. It becomes something to spend like energy itself. If hunger is mild, the group can afford caution. They can choose safer plants, safer terrain, safer timing. But as hunger deepens, the acceptable risk threshold rises. They may approach a carcass they would have avoided yesterday. They may cross open ground that feels exposed. They may push into unfamiliar territory, because staying is now the greater danger. In other words, the brain does not simply say danger. It weighs danger against the slow certainty of starvation, and sometimes starvation is the more immediate predator. This is why the next chapter begins here. Food is not a reward, but a condition for existence, not to end. It is not the nice part of the day. It is the engine that forces every other part of life to happen. The reason the body keeps walking. The reason the senses stay sharp. The reason the group holds together or breaks apart. The reason memory keeps rewriting itself. In that world, eating is not what follows survival. Eating is what makes survival possible. One more step, one more day, one more generation. Food for humans. 1 million years ago was not part of culture, and certainly not pleasure or enjoyment. It was the force that compelled them to keep moving, keep watching, keep accepting risk. There was no concept of moderate eating, no fixed schedule, no meal that could be expected. There were only rare moments when energy appeared, and when that happened, the group's entire attention narrowed onto a single goal: take advantage before the opportunity vanished. 1 million years ago, there was no such thing as a normal day of eating, because nothing in that world was stable enough to be called normal. There were days that passed with only a few small pieces of food, just enough to keep the body from collapsing in the middle of a journey. There were days with almost nothing substantial, when every effort to find food produced no result. And then very rarely there were days unlike the rest, when a large food source appeared suddenly, not because a plan had succeeded, but because circumstances happened to allow it. A tree fruiting at the right moment. A patch of land where rain had exposed edible roots. The carcass of an animal left behind after another species' hunt. But in the memory of humans at that time, such days were not recorded as luck. They did not create a sense of security, and they were not seen as signs that a good period was about to begin. On the contrary, they were understood, though not in words, as temporary, fragile moments that could not last. The survival instinct did not allow them to believe that good things would return on a schedule. There was no concept of next time, no waiting. So when food appeared, they did not delay, hesitate, or save it for some distant future. They ate quickly, took as much as they could, and then prepared to withdraw because the presence of food itself also drew danger. That way of eating reflected a deep, unspoken understanding of the surrounding world. Food did not only sustain life, it also signaled it. The smell of ripe fruit attracted insects and other animals. The smell of meat attracted predators even more dangerous. The longer they stayed, the greater the risk became, and so the act of eating was always tied to the act of leaving. There was no lingering, no idea of savoring. Food was treated as a short-term condition for continued existence, not something to build stability upon. Within that picture gathering became the most stable foundation of their diet, not because it was abundant, but because it was to some extent predictable. Roots tubers, seasonal fruit seeds, and young leaves did not deliver explosive energy, but they were widespread and less risky than meat. Gathering did not require direct confrontation with other creatures, did not force a life or death gamble in a single moment. But in exchange, it demanded a very different kind of intelligence, spatial and temporal memory, precise to the point of cruelty. Humans had to remember which plants bore fruit in which season, not by a fixed calendar, but by subtle environmental cues, changes in leaf color, the moisture of the soil, the appearance of certain insects. A small error in reading those cues could mean arriving too early when the tree offered nothing, or too late when another species had already taken the food. Places that had once yielded edible roots could not be harvested forever. Over time, the soil became exhausted. Roots shrank or vanished entirely. Returning too soon brought no benefit. Returning too late could mean missing the opportunity altogether. All of that information was not written down, not systematized into spoken knowledge. It existed in the brain as biological maps activated when the body needed energy. When hunger rose, the eyes automatically searched for familiar plants. The feet naturally angled toward areas that had once produced results, unless memory of depletion or danger blocked the path. This was not a conscious choice, but a reflex built through hundreds of trials and errors. Gathering was not purely individual either. Within a group, memory of food sources was distributed among multiple people. One individual might remember the location of a particular tree. Another might be sensitive to the right moment for harvesting. Moving together, these fragments of memory complemented each other, forming a search system far more effective than any single individual could manage alone. No one held all the information, but the group collectively knew enough not to starve. What is striking is that the relative stability of gathering did not produce long-term safety. It only reduced the amplitude of deprivation. It did not remove deprivation itself. The body remained accustomed to lacking energy, accustomed to functioning in a state of never being fully full. This made humans highly sensitive to any sign of richer energy sources. A rare opportunity carried immense pull because it could create a small surplus of energy, however brief, allowing the body to recover a little before moving on. For that reason, gathering was not a sign of a settled, peaceful life, but a fragile balance between risk and reward. It kept humans alive long enough to wait for other opportunities to appear. It did not solve hunger completely, but it made hunger bearable. And in a world where everything was temporary, that capacity to endure sometimes mattered more than any abundant supply of food. In that rhythm of life, humans did not expect tomorrow to be better than today. They only hoped today would not be worse than yesterday. Food, whether scarce or unexpectedly plentiful, was always treated as a short-lived gift of circumstance, not something to rely on long-term. That attitude, eat when there is food, do not believe in its scheduled return, kept humans flexible, always ready to leave when conditions changed. And from here, food became a silent driving force, compelling them to keep moving, keep remembering, and keep surviving in a world that had never promised anything. Meat, although richer in energy, was a high-risk source of food. Humans were not always the active hunters. In many cases, they arrived after others. The carcass of a large animal left behind after another predator's kill was an opportunity, but also a potential trap. Hyenas, lions, leopards, and other species could return at any time. Therefore, approaching a carcass required careful observation, quick assessment, and decisive action. It was in these moments that stone tools revealed their importance. Acheulean hand axes were not symbols of refinement. They were tools of efficiency. They were used to cut thick hide strip muscle, and especially to crack bones for marrow, the most energy-rich part, the hardest to reach, and also the part least contested by other species. The ability to extract marrow allowed humans to exploit what remained, turning a carcass that others had abandoned into a precious source of life. Eating meat was not a collective ritual. It happened quickly under tension, often in silence. Each person focused on their portion while still remaining alert to the surrounding environment. There was no table, no fair division according to moral norms. Distribution followed: position, strength, and access. Who arrived first, who stood closest, who was fast enough to take something before withdrawal became necessary. In that context, eating was not a deep act of social bonding. It was an urgent act. What matters is that eating was never separated from movement. A large food source rarely allowed them to stay long. The smell of blood and decay drew other predators. Finishing a meal did not mean safety. On the contrary, it was often the signal that it was time to leave. The body was fuller, but the environment had become more dangerous. Food, therefore, did not anchor humans in place. It only provided enough energy to continue the journey. This way of eating shaped the rhythm of life itself. There was no long-term storage, no cache. Everything depended on the present. That made humans extremely sensitive to small shifts in the environment. When food became scarce, they traveled farther. When gathering sources thinned, they did not cling to a place. The body and brain together sent the message that staying was dangerous. And so they left. Eating in order to keep moving also meant accepting hunger as part of life. Hunger was not always an immediate emergency, but a baseline feeling present to some degree, almost all the time. The body became accustomed to functioning without full energy. This produced a kind of endurance very different from that of modern humans, who often treat hunger as a problem to be solved quickly. For humans 1 million years ago, hunger became dangerous only when it lasted too long, without any chance of replenishment. The instability of eating was not merely a physiological problem. It seeped into the way humans existed together. When food was abundant, during rare periods when fruit ripened in large amounts, roots were easy to dig, or a major meat source appeared unexpectedly, the group could sustain a larger size. More individuals could remain in one area without immediately stressing the environment. In such moments, each other's presence brought clear benefit, more eyes to watch, more hands to gather, more bodies to deter danger. A larger group meant a relative sense of safety, even if it lasted only briefly. But that state did not endure. When food began to run out, the shift did not arrive as a dramatic event. It happened quietly. The distance between successful finds grew longer. Weaker individuals started to lag. Travel time increased, while energy gained decreased. And, at a certain threshold, body and brain together produced a clear signal: staying with the same numbers was dangerous. At that point, the group had to split into smaller units. This splitting was not tragic. There was no farewell ritual, no obvious conflict like the collapse of society we might imagine. It was simply a survival reflex. One part of the group turned in another direction, often along routes that had once been familiar. Another part stayed a little longer, then also moved on. No one was abandoned in a moral sense. Each separation was understood as a way to increase the chances of survival for everyone. What matters is that each smaller group did not begin from zero. They carried a portion of shared memory, a portion of accumulated experience. The biological maps in the brain, where water was, where food appeared seasonally, where danger had occurred, were shared not through words, but through silent consensus. Basic skills like extracting roots, approaching carcasses, and reading environmental cues did not belong to any single individual. They existed within the group, and when the group split, that knowledge dispersed with it. This was an early form of transmission of survival knowledge, even without tradition or formal teaching. This flexibility helped humans avoid a deadly trap, exhausting resources by staying too long. A large group could take advantage when conditions were favorable, but a small group adapted better when scarcity arrived. No fixed structure was maintained regardless of circumstance. Group size, therefore, was not an expression of power or status, but an ecological variable shaped by the energy available in the environment. Food in this context did not only nourish bodies, it became a force that regulated social structure. It determined when to stay and when to leave, when to bond together for safety, and when to spread out to reduce pressure on resources. There were no written laws, no declared principles, but there were clear limits imposed directly by human physiology and the environment's capacity to regenerate. When those limits were crossed, when the group was too large for the available food or stayed too long in a depleted area, danger did not arrive as moral punishment. It arrived as hunger, exhaustion, and death. For this reason, the society of humans 1 million years ago was not a stable structure to be defended, but a flexible state that had to be adjusted continuously. Bonding was not a value in itself. It mattered only insofar as it served survival. Dispersal was not failure. It was a rational strategy under scarcity. Later concepts such as loyalty territory or fixed community had no real place in that world. In a life rhythm driven by food, humans learned to accept the temporary nature of every connection. They lived together when conditions allowed and separated when necessary, not because they lacked attachment, but because they understood, even without words, that each individual's survival extended the existence of the whole lineage. And it was precisely that unsentimental flexibility that allowed humans to endure long stretches of instability where any rigid structure could become the cause of extinction. One notable point is that humans at this time did not cook in the full sense. Control of fire, if it existed, was still highly limited and unstable. Most food was consumed raw or only mechanically processed with stone tools. This placed additional pressure on the digestive system and made food choice even more important. Energy-rich, easily digestible sources, such as marrow or softer meat, became especially valuable because they delivered more energy for less effort. Throughout this entire process, the brain continually remembered the relationship between food and danger. A place that had yielded food but carried high risk would be marked as not worth returning to. A place that offered little food but greater safety might be prioritized during difficult periods. Spatial memory, sensory memory, and group experience blended together, forming a flexible feeding strategy, though it was never named as such. Thus, when we say that humans 1 million years ago ate in order to keep moving, This is not merely a biological description. It is a principle of life. Food was not the ultimate goal, but the means of extending existence a little longer. There was no concept of lasting fullness, only brief windows when energy was replenished enough for the legs to keep stepping, enough for the brain to keep watching, and enough for the group to survive another stretch of journey in a world that never allowed them to stop for long. The next chapter will take us into the most dangerous time of day-night, when food disappears, vision collapses, and sleep becomes a risky behavior rather than true rest. After each day of movement and food searching, the body of a human 1 million years ago was not granted a reward called rest. It was merely transferred from one form of risk to another. The dangers of daylight exposure, exhaustion, confrontation, misjudgment did not end when the sun lowered. They were only replaced by a different configuration of threats, less visible, but no less real. Survival did not pause with darkness. It simply entered a new phase governed by different rules. As the light faded, as the scent of food still lingered faintly in the air, as tired feet carried the accumulated strain of a day spent following fragile traces of energy, the world did not soften. It did not offer relief or closure. Instead, it reassembled itself. Shapes lost their edges. Distances collapsed. Familiar landmarks dissolved into shadow. What had been readable by sight during the day now had to be inferred, guessed, or sensed indirectly. Night did not erase danger. It transformed it. Threats no longer announced themselves through movement clearly seen or forms easily recognized. They emerged as uncertainty, something half heard, half smelled, half imagined. A presence could be close without being visible. A mistake could be made without warning. In daylight, danger could often be anticipated. At night, it could arrive fully formed. The same environment that had demanded endurance by day now demanded restraint. Movement itself became risky. A misplaced step could produce sound. A silhouette could form against moonlight. Even stillness carried danger, because remaining too long in one place allowed other creatures better adapted to darkness to approach unnoticed. Night compressed the margin for error. It punished both carelessness and overconfidence. For bodies already depleted by hunger and distance, this transition mattered deeply. Muscles that had worked all day now needed recovery, yet recovery itself required vulnerability. Eyes closed meant blindness. Deep sleep meant withdrawal. And withdrawal in a world not designed for safety was never neutral. The body stood at a constant crossroads: rest too little and weaken for the next day, or rest too much and risk not waking at all. In this way, night was not the opposite of day. It was its continuation, an extension of the same struggle reshaped by darkness. The cycle of survival did not alternate between effort and peace, but between visible danger and invisible danger. Day tested the body's capacity to move and endure. Night tested its capacity to remain present while resting to yield without surrendering completely. There was no clear boundary where survival stopped and rest began. Instead, there was only a shift in emphasis. The question was no longer how far to walk or what to eat, but how to remain alive while still enough to repair the damage of the day. And in that narrow space between exhaustion and alertness, between darkness and awareness, the human body learned one of its earliest lessons. Survival is not about escaping risk, but about navigating it continuously, without pause, even when the world appears to be sleeping. Sleep in this context was not a release. It was a fragile compromise between biological necessity and harsh reality. The body needed sleep in order not to collapse. But sleeping too deeply too long or too alone could be a final decision. There were no beds, no doors, no protective light. Only darkness, unnamed sounds, and a sky that felt familiar by day and alien by night. There was no concept of safe sleep. Safety existed only as a lesser degree of danger within a chain of bad options. For this reason, humans learned to sleep in groups, not out of intimacy, but out of probability. Many bodies lying close together created warmth, slowing heat loss as the cold of the savanna settled in. But more importantly, more ears meant earlier detection. A snapping branch, an unfamiliar breath, a rustle too close. In the night, such small signals mattered more than comfort. Sleep was never continuous. It fractured into small, disconnected fragments, interwoven with waking and dreaming relaxation and vigilance. There was no idea of a full night's sleep. The body learned to sink quickly and rise quickly. These short cycles were not enough to produce prolonged deep sleep, but they were enough to dull exhaustion enough for muscles to loosen briefly before being ready to respond again. This was not sleep for optimal recovery. It was sleep for precarious balance. Waking during the night was not an accident. It was part of the survival design. The body did not need a clear reason to open its eyes. A minor environmental shift, a strange sound, a change in wind direction, an unusual silence was enough to break rest. Waking was not about observing the world as scenery, but about checking whether the fragile safety of a few minutes earlier still held. Opening one's eyes was an act of defense, not curiosity. In that world, deep sleep was not an aspiration. Deep sleep meant temporarily withdrawing from the environment, and at night, that could be fatal. What mattered was not sleep quality, but waking timing. Waking fast enough to react, early enough to avoid being surrounded, before danger shifted from possibility into reality. Sleep thus became a skill, not a passive state. Night also completely rearranged the sensory hierarchy. By day, vision was the primary guide. Light allowed distance estimation, shape recognition, and motion prediction. But when light withdrew, sight quickly lost control. Darkness flattened the world, erasing depth and boundaries. In that void, hearing and smell moved forward, becoming the new guiding senses. Nighttime hearing did not seek loud or obvious sounds. It was tuned to deviation. The brain did not need to know exactly what a sound was. It only needed to recognize that it did not belong to the familiar background. An uneven rhythm among natural noises. A sharp breath cutting through wind. A branch snapping at a height not produced by small animals. These tiny details were instantly compared to stored danger patterns. Reaction came before thought. The body tensed before fear had a name. Notably, silence itself carried meaning. In many natural environments, night is never completely quiet. Insects wind, and small creatures create a continuous soundscape. When that background abruptly vanished, it could signal that a large predator was very near. The brain of humans 1 million years ago learned to fear that abnormal silence, not emotionally, but because it had repeatedly preceded deadly outcomes. Smell became an equally important channel of information. Night wind carried signals that daylight often masked. The damp fur scent of large animals, the disturbed smell of earth compressed by heavy steps, the lingering odor of blood from a hurried meal earlier. These scents were not analyzed logically. The brain did not ask, "What is this smell?" It asked, "What did this smell lead to before?" And the answer, etched across countless generations, determined the next response. Even a brief unfamiliar scent could cause the entire group to reposition. No loud alarm, no chaotic movement, just small adjustments enough to disrupt the group's familiar outline under moonlight. Pulling closer together or spreading farther apart, shifting body orientation, changing sleeping positions, waking the entire group or only a few individuals to monitor the situation. These decisions emerged almost simultaneously without speech because everybody was reading the same environment. In such moments, there was no clear boundary between sleeping and waking. There were intermediate states where bodies remained still, but brains operated at high alert, ears open, noses open, muscles ready to contract. This was not deep sleep, but waiting a state that conserved energy while keeping an exit open. Across thousands of such nights, the human nervous system was trained to endure fragmentation. A complete sleep cycle was not required to survive. Only enough short rest fragments stitched together to prevent collapse the next day. This adaptation differs sharply from modern expectations where deep, uninterrupted sleep is considered a health standard. For humans, 1 million years ago, the only standard was simple. Could you stand up the next morning or not? And within these fragmented nights, a silent lesson was etched deeply into the species. The world is never entirely safe, and survival depends on keeping part of awareness open even when the body must rest. The habits formed 1 million years ago did not vanish when humans entered history. They transformed. The biological core remained merely layered with new meanings. For prehistoric humans, fragmented sleep was a direct response to real danger. They woke to strange sounds, unfamiliar scents, abnormal silence. Fear had a concrete shape, predators, rivals, cold darkness. The body did not need justification to stay alert. The environment itself was justification. Waking carried no spiritual or moral meaning. It was simply how one survived until morning. When humans entered the medieval world, many of those dangers were pushed outward by walls, roofs, dense communities, and more stable social structures. Yet something curious remained. Fragmented sleep did not disappear. Medieval people still woke during the night. They still divided sleep into two phases. They still treated night as a time apart, not fully belonging to rest. What changed was the explanation. Prehistoric humans woke because of real danger. Medieval humans woke because danger was interpreted. Instead of predators, they feared demons. Instead of unfamiliar scents, they feared wandering spirits. Instead of physical darkness, they feared moral darkness. Ancient biological habits, waking at night, vigilance, silence, listening, were no longer explained through natural environments, but legitimized through customs, beliefs, and rituals. Night waking became prayer time. Night alertness became religious duty. Unease was no longer called a survival reflex. It was called a trial of the soul. In other words, medieval people did not sleep differently from their prehistoric ancestors. They told a different story about the same behavior. The body still carried the ancient memory that night is less safe than day. But when physical danger diminished, the human brain, unable to tolerate an absence of meaning, filled the gap with symbols. What had been biological reflex became custom. What had been vigilance became morality. What had been concrete fear became invisible anxiety. Thus, the transition from prehistory to the Middle Ages did not erase old habits. It reinterpreted them. Humans did not stop waking at night. They simply stopped naming the animal in the darkness and began naming other forces better suited to the world they inhabited. At the deepest level, this reveals a striking continuity. Before humans learned how to sleep safely, they learned how to explain why they could not sleep peacefully. And every era in its own way, constructed a reason compelling enough to justify the wakefulness that had been embedded in the human body long before history existed. Choosing where to sleep, therefore, was a life and death decision. There was no home, but there were places that were less bad. Avoid valley bottoms where cold air pooled. Avoid water edges where predators came to drink at night. Avoid established animal paths. Prefer locations with just enough open visibility to detect movement, yet enough cover to break the body's outline. Under moonlight, a large tree trunk, a rock outcrop, the edge of sparse woodland. These choices were never named, but repeated often enough to become habit. Not every night was the same. Some nights were dangerously quiet when prolonged silence deprived the brain of familiar reference patterns. Other nights were noisy when insects whined and footsteps blurred the boundary between signal and noise. In both cases, sleep remained risky. The body had to decide how much rest was necessary to avoid collapse tomorrow while still retaining enough vigilance to avoid becoming prey. Sleeping in groups also shaped individual placement. There was no fixed order, but there were tacit arrangements. Children and weaker individuals tended to lie toward the center, with less direct exposure to darkness. Those sensitive to sound, or who had previously reacted in time on past nights, tended to occupy the edges not out of bravery, but experience. Roles were not assigned. They emerged through behavior that had helped the group survive. Sleep was when bodily vulnerability was most exposed. When awake, humans could move, observe, adjust. When asleep, those abilities diminished. Night belonged to predators, not because they were stronger, but because they were better suited to darkness. Humans did not confront night directly. They avoided it, folded into it, and passed through it via short rests, waiting for light to return. There were no bedtime rituals, no prayers, no lullabies, only bodily arrangement and deliberate silence, minimal movement, minimal noise, minimal unfamiliar scent. Anything that highlighted the group's presence increased risk. Sleep was therefore a wordless discipline, the discipline of not drawing attention. Time at night was not measured in hours. It was measured by temperature changes, by moon position, by the group's broken wake-sleep rhythm. Each eye opening was a rapid check. Each posture shift was a calculation between warmth and silence. These small decisions repeated thousands of nights etched a form of sleep radically different from what modern humans consider normal. Sleep in that world also left lasting marks on the mind. Fear did not exist as a long narrative. It came and went with signals. When danger passed, the body relaxed quickly. When danger appeared, tension surged instantly. There were no prolonged aftershocks because the brain had no room for useless worry. Energy had to be saved for the next day. This balance, rapid tension, rapid release was forged through thousands of nights survived without major error. Notably, despite its fragility, sleep remained where the body repaired daily damage. Muscles partially recovered. The nervous system reset enough to continue remembering and responding. If sleep was too disrupted for too many nights, the body slowed, reflexes dulled, and risk increased. Thus, groups did not only seek low danger, they sought rhythm, a sleep rhythm sufficient to avoid collapse, yet alert enough to avoid predation. There was never a guarantee that the night would pass safely. Some nights ended with the entire group remaining awake and moving through darkness, accepting a new risk to avoid an old one. Some nights were interrupted by brief threats that faded away, and some rare nights were quiet enough for bodies to sink slightly deeper into shallow sleep. These nights were not remembered as rewards, only as temporary pauses in a long continuum of vigilance. Sleep in an unsafe world did not teach humans to dream. It taught them to adjust rest, adjust position, adjust distance between bodies, adjust responses to small signals. These adjustments, repeated across countless generations, produced a form of sleep suited to daytime endurance and nighttime alertness. When the first light returned, the night left no record, no report, no story, only bodies still intact, and that was the only measure of success. Humans rose, withdrew from temporary shelter, and continued onward. The new day did not begin with refreshment. It began with the fact that they had not yet been removed from the game. The next chapter will turn to another layer of protection clothing, not as expression or culture, but as a way to extend the body's tolerance slightly further against sun, wind, and cold. But before moving on, hold this moment. The sleep of humans 1 million years ago was not a refuge from the world. It was a way of remaining within the world without being consumed by the dark. Today, when we think about clothing, we think about choice. Color, material, style, personal expression. Clothes are something we put on after we are safe, after we have houses, walls, fire, work schedules, and weather forecasts. We dress to express who we are or how we wish to be seen. But if we turn back 1 million years, wearing was not a choice. It was the final boundary between the body and the environment, a crude layer of protection meant to extend endurance just a little longer. For humans of that time, clothing did not begin with aesthetics, nor was it tied to identity. It carried no message. It did not distinguish us from them. It did not signal an individual's position within the group. It began with skin, with very concrete, very physical signals that the body could not ignore. The sun did not merely illuminate, it burned. Standing too long at midday, skin heated to the point of pain, moisture evaporating from the body faster than it could be replaced. Sweat, while helping dissipate heat, also carried away water. The body did not think in terms like heat stroke. It simply registered that continued exposure meant rapid weakening. A crude covering animal hide, plant fibers, anything that reduced direct contact, did not make the sun disappear, but it made it less destructive. The cold night wind was different. It did not arrive as a sudden blow, but as a patient force drawing warmth away from the body minute by minute. When the sun slipped below the horizon, heat drained rapidly from the land, especially in open environments like the savanna, where there were few barriers to slow the movement of air. The ground that had radiated warmth during the day began to release it upward into the dark sky, and the body exposed upright and lightly covered became part of that exchange. Bare skin, which had been an advantage under the daytime sun, now turned into a liability. During the day, sparse body hair and exposed skin allowed heat to dissipate efficiently, preventing overheating during long hours of movement. At night, the same traits worked in reverse. Wind passed freely across the skin, carrying heat away through convection, while evaporation from sweat still present. Even after movement slowed, accelerated cooling further. The body did not register this as a single moment of danger, but as a gradual slide toward weakness. As core temperature dropped, the consequences unfolded quietly. Reflexes slowed first almost imperceptibly. Muscles that had carried the body across long distances during the day began to stiffen, losing elasticity and speed. Fine motor control diminished, making quick adjustments harder. The nervous system, forced to allocate energy toward maintaining basic warmth, had less capacity left for vigilance and rapid response. In this state, danger did not need to be dramatic, to be lethal. A delayed reaction, a slower turn of the head, a stumble while rising, any one of these could tip the balance. The body attempted to compensate. Metabolism increased to generate heat-burning precious energy reserves that were already thin after a day of movement and limited food. Shivering when it occurred was not a sign of comfort-seeking, but of emergency, a mechanical attempt to convert muscle activity into warmth. But energy spent on staying warm was energy unavailable for fleeing fighting, or even lasting until morning. Cold in this sense was not just an environmental condition. It was a slow drain on future possibilities. A rough covering did not solve this problem. An animal hide thrown over the shoulders, a bundle of plant fibers wrapped around the torso, these did not create warmth in themselves. They did not seal the body from the night, nor did they stop the wind entirely. What they did was subtler, but crucial. They slowed the loss. By trapping a thin layer of air close to the skin, by breaking the direct flow of wind, they reduced the rate at which heat escaped. The body still cooled, but more slowly. Metabolic demands still rose, but not as sharply. Muscles retained flexibility just long enough. Reflexes remained usable just long enough. In many nights, that margin was all that mattered. Survival did not depend on being warm. It depended on not becoming too cold too quickly. It depended on staying responsive long enough for the night to pass, for the first light to return, for movement to begin again. In this context, clothing was not a source of comfort. It was a brake on deterioration. It bought time, sometimes only minutes, sometimes hours, but in a world measured in narrow margins, time itself was the most valuable resource. The night wind then was not merely unpleasant. It was an active force shaping behavior, posture grouping, and the earliest forms of protection. Humans did not cover themselves to feel secure. They covered themselves to remain functional. And often that small difference between rapid heat loss and slower heat loss was enough to decide whether the body would still be capable of responding when danger finally appeared in the dark. Then there were the constant abrasions of the journey. Scrub tore at skin. Thorns pierced feet and thighs. Sharp stones opened small but repeated wounds. Each scratch was not only painful. In a world without antiseptics or treatment, it was an open door to infection, weakening, and slow death. Wearing in this context meant allowing a layer to take damage instead of the skin. Animal hide tore first. Plant fibers wore down first. The body remained intact a little longer. Thus, wearing emerged not to look better, but to hurt less. Less burning, less cold, less abrasion, and most importantly, to avoid stopping simply because the body could no longer tolerate the environment. In a world where standing still was often as dangerous as moving, the ability to keep going was a condition of survival. Clothing in its most primitive form was a tool to extend that ability. Before clothing existed, the human body itself had already changed to adapt to long-distance movement. Hair became sparser. Skin was exposed more fully. These changes were not progress in a moral sense, but the result of a biological trade-off. Less hair allowed more effective heat dissipation under intense sun, especially when paired with sweating. This enabled humans to move longer in hot conditions, where many other species were forced to stop. But the cost was clear: a body more exposed to cold wind, rain, and physical impact. That trade-off could only persist if there were a compensatory solution from outside the body. Not from genes, but from behavior. Not from biological evolution, but from using the environment as an extension of the body. This additional layer of protection was not born with humans. It was found picked up and worn. The skin of another species became a second skin. Plant fibers became a soft boundary between body and world. Inanimate materials were drawn into the circle of survival not because humans sought to dominate nature, but because they needed it to continue existing. What is striking is that this layer never fully replaced biological function. It did not make the body immune to cold heat or pain. It merely reduced the intensity of these forces to a level the body could still endure. And it was precisely this reduction that allowed evolution to continue along its chosen path, a less hairy body optimized for heat loss, but dependent on flexible behavior to offset its new vulnerabilities. Thus, clothing at this stage was not an independent invention. It was the remainder of a larger adaptive process, one in which body and environment were not separate, but complementary. Humans did not only change their form to suit the world, they began to change how they touched the world. And from that moment on, wearing was no longer something external to the body. It became part of a survival strategy, silent, crude, but sufficient to extend life a little further. B. The earliest garments had no stable form because human life itself was unstable. There were no shirts or trousers in any familiar sense, no predetermined sizes, no concept of fit. There were only materials obtained by chance animal hides, coarse hair plant fibers, placed on the body in the simplest ways possible. They were wrapped around shoulders, draped loosely over the back, tied temporarily at the waist or chest, then removed, adjusted, repositioned as conditions demanded. There was no moment of being fully dressed, only an ongoing process of adjustment. This covering followed the rhythm of the day. When cold winds rose, it was pulled closer to the skin. When the sun climbed high, it was loosened or removed entirely. When humans moved through dense brush or sharp rock, it was wrapped tighter around vulnerable areas. Wearing was not a decision made once and maintained. It was a chain of small reactions guided by reading the environment through the body. Skin sensed first, hands adjusted next. No extended deliberation was required. In this context, the boundary between clothing and tool nearly vanished. An animal hide did not only shield from sun or cold, it could wrap food, carry gathered items, block wind during rest, or be spread on the ground to sit upon. A binding cord did not only hold a covering in place, it could become a carrying strap, a pulling line, or a way to fasten another object to the body. Everything served multiple purposes because there was no room for specialization. The body could not carry many things, so each object had to do many jobs. This multifunctionality meant that clothing never became an independent object. It was always ready to change form. When it no longer needed to shield it, became a carrier. When it no longer carried, it was worn again. Anything that no longer directly supported movement and endurance gradually became a burden, and burdens were abandoned. There was no sentimentality, no long-term storage. The world changed faster than possessions could be kept. More important still, clothing was never separate from movement. Humans did not wear in order to stay still, to pose, or to be seen. They wore in order to keep going. For that reason, coverings could not be heavy, rigid, or bulky. They had to allow bending, to gather extending strides, twisting to avoid obstacles, climbing or sliding without obstruction. If a layer slowed movement, increased fatigue, or interfered with rapid reaction, it immediately became dangerous. A good layer of protection in that world was one the wearer did not have to think about. It was present enough to reduce damage, but did not demand constant attention. It did not restrict breathing force posture or create a sense of confinement. Humans did not adjust their movement to accommodate clothing. Clothing had to be flexible enough to follow the body. When that ceased to be true, it was loosened, removed, or left behind. Thus, wearing at this stage was not a stable condition, but an ongoing action, It changed by the hour with weather terrain and bodily fatigue. There were no norms for comparison, no models to imitate. There was only one silent but unmistakable criterion. Does this help me keep going? This flexibility in material use and expectation allowed humans to exist without stopping to build fixed structures. Clothing did not anchor them to a place. It traveled with them, changed with them, and disappeared when no longer needed. In a world 1 million years ago, where survival depended on moment-by-moment adaptation, this was not deprivation. It was a very primitive form of freedom, the freedom to keep moving without being weighed down by what one carried. Clothing was also not optimized for any single condition. It was not thick enough for deep cold, not sealed enough for prolonged rain, not durable enough to last indefinitely. But it was flexible enough to respond to many situations. In a world where conditions shifted faster than preparation allowed, flexibility mattered more than perfection. Humans did not seek to defeat the weather. They sought to endure it just enough to pass through. Wearing, therefore, was an extension of the body rather than a separate layer. There was no clear inside-outside boundary like that of modern clothing. Human skin, animal, hide plant, fiber, wind, sun, all participated in a continuous regulatory system. When cold, the covering retained heat. When hot, it was loosened to release it. When struck, it absorbed abrasion in place of skin. The body was never fully protected. It was only relieved of some pressure. Clothing also reflected how humans confronted risk. No one dressed for absolute safety, because absolute safety did not exist. They dressed for a higher probability of survival. When wind increased, they wrapped more tightly. When sun intensified, they shaded more. When crossing sharp terrain, they reinforced vulnerable points. Wearing was a series of small, continuous decisions with no fixed standard. There was no social differentiation through clothing. No one dressed to signal status. No one dressed to mark distinction. When a covering stood out too much, it became an attraction, and attraction was dangerous. In that context, concealment mattered more than display. Good clothing was clothing that did not draw attention, whether from predators or competitors. Wearing was also tightly bound to experience. An individual once weakened by cold wind would wrap more tightly at night. One who had suffered severe abrasion in dense brush would protect more carefully thereafter. These adjustments were not taught in words. They were learned through the body. Children watched how adults wrapped, tied, removed, and imitated them. Knowledge was not explained. It was transmitted through action. Over time, ways of wearing repeated under similar conditions became habits. But they were not yet customs. There was no rule that said this is how one must dress. There was only experience saying this helps one survive longer. And in that world, that was the only standard that mattered. Crucially, clothing never created the illusion of safety. It did not replace vigilance. It did not allow humans to remain longer in dangerous places. It only extended endurance enough to provide more options. Clothing did not make night safe. It only made cold less lethal. It did not soften the sun. It only made burning less severe. Everything was less not gone. Compared to today, the greatest difference lies not in materials, but in expectations. Today we dress expecting complete protection from cold, heat, rain, abrasion. When clothing fails, we consider it inadequate. For humans, 1 million years ago, clothing was never expected to be perfect. It was expected to be sufficient, and sufficient could change by the hour. This approach, not seeking perfection, only adequacy, allowed humans to survive across a wide range of environments without stopping to build permanent bases. Clothing did not anchor them. It moved with them. Light quickly adjustable, constantly responsive. Wearing was part of movement like footsteps and breathing. And perhaps, if we look closely, traces of this habit remain in us today. We still add layers when cold, remove them when hot. We still adjust collars, sleeves, outer layers in response to immediate bodily sensation. Even in a much safer world, the body does not fully trust stability. It still responds to wind, to cold, to sunlight, as if preparing to move on. The next chapter will move away from the individual body to examine living together, how humans formed groups before society laws or leaders. But hold on to this thought: before clothing became a symbol, it was once a very ancient whisper of the body, reminding us that the world was not designed for humans. Before there was society, prehistoric humans still lived together. Not because they believed in community, and certainly not because they possessed concepts like duty or morality. They stayed close because in that world, being alone was the greatest risk. Everything else, intimacy, attachment roles, came later as the consequence of surviving side by side for long enough. Human groups 1 million years ago did not exist as fixed units that had to be maintained through rules or titles. They were small, flexible, and always in a state of potential change, not because people lacked the ability to organize, but because the environment did not allow long-term stability. There was no standard number for a group. A group might shrink to only a few individuals during scarcity, then grow again when conditions improved. Size did not reflect strength or status. It reflected how much energy the environment could support at that moment. When food became scarce, groups contracted not through conflict, but through biological pressure. Every additional mouth increased the risk. Splitting happened quietly, without formal agreement or visible rupture. A few individuals turned in another direction, carrying shared memory and basic skills, trying their chances elsewhere. When conditions improved, fruiting seasons, stable water, or a new area that had not yet been exhausted, smaller groups could meet, again, remain near one another longer, and form larger gatherings without any merger in the official sense. The group in this way breathed with the rhythm of the environment, expanding and contracting like a living body. There were no fixed territorial boundaries to defend. No lines were patrolled. Holding a single area for long periods was too costly because the environment changed faster than humans could control it. A group existed where it could be fed and left when the signs of depletion began to appear. There was no concept of our land in the sense of ownership, only places where survival had once been possible, and places that no longer were. Nor was there a stable center of power. No one held long-term authority to command. Roles emerged with circumstances and dissolved when circumstances shifted. Today, the guide might be the one who remembered the route to water. Tomorrow, that same individual might slow with fatigue, and someone else would naturally move to the front. Leadership here was not a position, but a moment, the moment when one person's behavior matched the group's survival needs better than anyone else's. For this reason, organization was not a structure built to maintain order. It was a temporary balance formed by the overlap of countless small decisions. There were no diagrams, no long-range plans, only continuous adjustments: slow down, or speed up, stay, or leave tightened together, or spread out. When the environment changed direction, the balance changed with it. The group did not resist change, it moved with it. Living together in that context meant, first of all, sharing risk. A solitary individual had to carry the entire world alone, watch in every direction, detect danger, react, and pay the full price if the reaction came too late. A single moment of inattention could end everything. In a group, that burden was distributed. No one had to look everywhere at once. No one had to remain at maximum alertness all day long. More eyes meant earlier detection. More ears meant better distinction between background noise and abnormal signals. More bodies broke the familiar silhouette of a single target, making it harder for predators to focus. By day, a group created presence that made approach more costly. By night, the group blurred outlines under moonlight, making an attack less certain. A group did not make humans invulnerable, but it reduced the probability of being singled out. The crucial point is that the group was not stronger than the individual in the sense of raw force. It could not necessarily confront threats head-on, but it was less fragile. If one person tired, others could still watch. If one person made an error, the group still had time to adjust. If someone suffered a minor injury, the presence of others could be enough to prevent immediate abandonment. The strength of the group was not in winning, it was in extending the time it could continue to exist. Sharing risk also meant accepting a minimal level of mutual dependence. No one was fully self-sufficient, yet no one was fully bound. Each person received benefits from the group while also serving as part of the group's shared vigilance system. A person's presence had value as long as their behavior reduced risk for the whole. When that stopped being true, closeness diminished naturally without explanation or punishment. Over time, this way of living produced a form of bonding very different from later societies. It was not based on laws, obligations, or shared beliefs. It was based on survival efficiency. Stay together because staying together is safer. Separate, when together, becomes dangerous. There was no moral judgment in these decisions, only constant adjustment to a world that never stopped changing. And from these small, flexible, ever-changeable groups, humans learned a fundamental lesson. Long survival does not always require a solid structure. Sometimes what keeps life going is the ability to dissolve at the right moment and gather again when needed. This sharing required no agreement. It happened naturally because the body could feel the difference between being alone and being near others. When someone was nearby, breathing slowed. When many bodies were close, the reflex of vigilance did not need to remain fully stretched. The presence of another person, even without words, was already a signal of relative safety. And in a world with no absolute safety, relative was enough. The group did not run on commands. No one led in a fixed sense. Roles emerged situationally. When moving across difficult ground, the one with surer footing naturally went first. When night watching mattered, the person most sensitive to sound stayed near the edge. When food appeared, those closest acted first not as privilege, but as distance. What determined role was not a name, but suitability in the moment. This kept group structure soft. No one held the center for long. A person could lead today, then slow tomorrow. Someone at the edge could move inward when injured. There was no permanent bond between individual and function. That flexibility allowed rapid adaptation to sudden change. Children in the Stone Age did not enter a clearly marked age of learning. There was no moment when they shifted from not knowing to knowing, from being cared for to being taught. Learning began as soon as their small bodies could hold balance on unsteady legs. No one called it learning. It was simply living in a world where every action carried information. They watched before they understood. They saw how adults stepped on uneven ground, where to place feet, where to avoid loose stone, where not to step on dry branches. They watched a hand touch a tree trunk to test stability the way someone bent to pull a root without disturbing too much soil. These details were not explained in words, but recorded through sensation. Children learned the rhythm of walking before they learned its purpose. They learned movement before they understood reasons. In that world, mistakes were not dramatized, but they were not ignored. When a child moved too quickly and fell, there was no long lecture. Perhaps only a gesture to slow down, a hand on the shoulder, a chance to try again. Correction was light enough not to terrify, but enough for the body to remember. Knowledge was not transmitted as command. It was carved into movement. Children were not separated from daily life to be protected. They were present in every activity, kept at a distance that was just safe enough. When the group moved, children moved too slow or surrounded. When adults stopped, children stopped. When the group became alert, children felt the tension in the air before they understood why. That sensation, the slight shift in posture, the change in adult breathing, became the earliest lesson about danger. There were no toys designed for them. The materials of the world stick small stones. Fibers became tools of exploration. Children held, pulled, tied, untied, imitating what they had seen. Through that, they learned not only how to use materials, but the limits of their own bodies, how far the arm could reach, how much force was enough, when to stop. Play and learning were not separate. They were the same process. What matters is that children did not learn alone. They learned inside a shared field of vision where adult behavior was always observable. Each repetition reinforced a pattern: how to react to an unfamiliar smell, how to become silent when necessary, how to shift position when wind changed. These patterns did not need names. The body simply recognized this behavior belongs with safety. That behavior belongs with risk. Over time, children learned not only skills, but the group's rhythm. When to move, when to stop, when to tense, when to release. That synchronization mattered as much as any specific skill. A child who could not keep rhythm could become a burden for everyone. So learning the rhythm happened early, not through harsh discipline, but through continuous immersion in the shared flow. There was no concept of teaching children morality, but through observation, children sensed which behaviors made others draw closer and which increased distance. No judgment was required. A small shift in closeness was enough for a child's body to remember. That is how early social boundaries formed, not through laws, but through feedback from the living environment. Childhood, then, was not a protected stage set apart. It was a period of being soaked in survival life, where learning and living were one. Children were not prepared for a distant future. They were prepared for tomorrow. And this slow learning, tied to the body and the environment, created humans who could step into harsh reality without verbal instruction, because their bodies already carried a map of survival. Living together was also a way to manage energy. Alone, everything cost more. In a group, tasks were broken up, not equally, but according to ability and position. In foraging, many searchers increased the chance of finding food. In approaching a carcass, a larger group could reach it faster and retreat sooner. The group did not guarantee success, but it reduced the cost of failure. Food sharing, when it happened, did not come from an ideal of fairness. It came from the reality that food was hard to defend alone. Eating alone extended the time of exposure and increased the risk of being detected. Eating together was faster, allowing retreat sooner. Sharing in many cases was a strategy to reduce danger, not a moral expression. Yet over time, repeated behaviors done for safety became habit, and habit is the seed of convention. Conflict did not disappear, but it rarely persisted. In a small group, prolonged conflict was a luxury few could afford. Every argument carried a cost energy spent on tension instead of movement, attention pulled inward instead of outward coordination, weakened at precisely the moments when the environment demanded coherence. While two individuals focused on one another, the world did not pause. Predators still moved, weather still shifted, opportunities still appeared and vanished. Conflict did not merely threaten social harmony, it threatened survival itself. Because of this, escalation was naturally constrained. There were no formal mechanisms to resolve disputes, no courts, no elders whose authority could impose a final decision. Yet conflicts rarely grew into lasting confrontations, not because people were more peaceful, but because the structure of life made persistence impractical. Holding on to anger required time. Time required safety. And safety in a world without guarantees was always provisional. When friction arose over access to food, proximity movement choices, or repeated risky behavior, it was often expressed through subtle changes rather than direct opposition. Distance increased. Eye contact diminished. One individual walked slightly behind or chose a different resting spot. These shifts did not announce a conflict. They enacted its resolution. The group did not need to name the disagreement in order to respond to it. Separation in this context was not failure. It was function. When tension threatened to disrupt coordination, dispersal allowed each part to regain stability on its own terms. A few individuals moved away, taking with them skills, memories, and patterns of behavior already tested. There was no formal break, no declaration of exile. The parting was often quiet, almost unremarkable, yet it prevented friction from consuming energy that the environment would soon demand. Importantly, dispersal did not imply hostility. Groups that separated could cross paths again weeks or months later under different conditions and coexist without carrying the weight of earlier tension. Without narratives to preserve grievance, conflict did not accumulate into history. It existed only as long as the situation that produced it remained relevant. Once circumstances changed, so did relationships. This mode of resolution also prevented the concentration of power. No individual could consistently dominate others through force or authority because dominance itself increased risk. A person whose behavior repeatedly endangered the group through aggression, recklessness, or refusal to adapt did not need to be punished. Their proximity simply decreased. They were less followed, less waited for, less included in shared movement. Over time, isolation emerged not as a sentence, but as an outcome. In this way, dispersal acted as a safety valve for the entire system. It released pressure before it could fracture coordination. It allowed multiple adaptive strategies to continue in parallel rather than forcing a single path. Some of those paths failed and disappeared. Others succeeded and were repeated. The group did not preserve unity at all costs. It preserved viability. From a modern perspective, this may appear unstable, even fragile. But in an unpredictable environment, fragility lay not in separation, but in rigidity. Systems that could not release tension broke under it. Systems that allowed tension to flow outward survived. Conflict then was not a problem to be solved. It was information evidence that a particular configuration no longer fit the environment. Separation was not punishment, but adjustment. And through countless cycles of quiet dispersal and occasional reunion, early human groups maintained a balance that no rule or authority could have enforced. The absence of verdicts, punishments, or lasting judgments did not signal moral emptiness. It reflected a different priority, not justice, not harmony, but continuity. What mattered was not who was right, but whether the group or its fragments could still be there tomorrow. Notably, attachment within the group was not based purely on kinship. Kin mattered, but it was not the only factor. Survival required behavioral fit, not only blood relation. An individual whose actions increased risk would soon be pushed toward the edge, not by proclamation, but by being less often followed. Conversely, someone who read the environment well and reacted quickly would be kept closer, because closeness increased survival odds. There were no rituals to reinforce community, no shared symbols, no shared stories told at night. What held the group together was the shared rhythm, waking together, walking together, stopping together, avoiding together. That rhythm maintained long enough created familiarity. And familiarity in that world was a form of safety. Living together before society also meant there was no clear outside. There was no abstract concept of stranger, only unfamiliar individuals, and the degree of risk attached to unfamiliarity. When encountering another group, the response was not war or diplomacy. It was fast assessment, distance, behavior, threat signals. If risk was high, avoid. If risk was low, coexist briefly, then separate again. No treaties existed, only short-term co-presence. In those brief encounters, knowledge could transfer without conscious intent. A new route could be learned by watching. A new technique for obtaining food could be copied. There was no deliberate teaching, only the spread of effective behavior. What helped survival was replicated. What failed disappeared with those who carried it. The group, therefore, was the minimal unit in which human intelligence could function, not as individual brilliance, but as distributed intelligence. Each person held a piece of information. The group assembled those pieces when necessary. When a group split, that intelligence split too, creating many parallel experiments in the environment. Failed experiments vanished. Successful ones repeated. There was no master plan, only selection through behavior. From a modern perspective, one might notice the absence of laws, leadership, and symbols. But that absence is precisely what allowed humans to survive under high volatility. Rigid structures break. Soft structures bend. A human group 1 million years ago was the softest structure possible, cohesive enough not to dissolve immediately, loose enough not to collapse when the environment turned. Living together then was not a social invention. It was a direct consequence of survival. Before humans had a society to belong to, they had a group so they would not die alone. Before they had laws to obey, they had habits to repeat. Before they had morality to believe in, they had behavioral fit as the condition for continuing to exist. The next chapter will move into the fragile boundary between repeated behavior and customs without names. Their survival habits begin to harden not because anyone decided, but because repetition long enough turns them into what should be done. But hold on to this: before society appeared, there was already a very ancient way of living together. No promises, no rules, only enough flexibility to keep existing for one more day. Before humans had customs, they could name there were already things that were done again and again. Not because someone commanded them like a leader, not because beliefs were articulated in words, but because those actions helped people survive better. When an action is repeated long enough across enough situations, it gradually becomes what should be done, even though no one yet possessed the concept of should in a moral sense. These were customs without names existing as an invisible, underlying layer of life. These customs did not appear in a single moment. They formed very slowly over thousands of similar days, in which the environment rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. Abstract thinking was not required to recognize this pattern. The body recognized it first. When things were done this way, the chance of survival increased. When they were done differently, risk increased. And the body, never fond of risk, naturally leaned toward what was safer. One of the earliest human customs did not lie in speech or ritual, but in the order of actions. This was not an order imposed, nor a sequence dictated by any individual. It emerged naturally from a shared sense of what should come first and what should come later in order to reduce danger. When a group stopped to rest, no one signaled assignments. Yet over time, certain positions were filled in familiar ways. Those who sat or stood at the edges tended to choose places with longer sight lines and clearer hearing, not because they were assigned to guard, but because their bodies, through repeated experience, recognized that from those positions, they could respond more effectively if something unusual occurred. Conversely, the less exposed, more sheltered positions were often occupied by those who needed more rest. If someone consistently chose a position with their back completely turned outward, they were not reprimanded. There were no reminders, no overt looks of disapproval, but very small adjustments took place. Others shifted, distances changed. That position was no longer held for long. Gradually, that person either changed places on their own or was gently moved elsewhere through the group's collective repositioning. Through many such repetitions, everyone learned to choose a suitable place, not out of fear of being wrong, but because they felt the ease that came from being in the right spot. Right here did not mean right according to rules. It meant right according to the group's silent acceptance. When each person occupied a place where their behavior did not increase risk for everyone else, things flowed more smoothly. No one needed to think much. The group functioned with less friction, and it was precisely this ease that caused the order of actions to be repeated, eventually solidifying into custom. Another custom formed around how food was approached, especially when a large source appeared unexpectedly. In such moments, opportunity was usually paired with danger. The smell of food attracted predators. Prolonged presence increased the chance of detection. Over many repetitions, one sequence of actions proved more effective than others' approach. Quickly take what was easiest, then withdraw. No one declared, "This is how we must eat." But when other behaviors led to higher risk, prolonged struggle, staying too long attempting to hold a food source, they naturally became less common. Those who lingered too long often caused the entire group to become more tense, more detectable. That tension did not need to be named. It was felt in breathing, in the restlessness spreading through the group. And when that restlessness repeatedly clustered around the same type of behavior, the group learned to avoid it. Thus, there was no concept of equal division by principle, but neither was there fixed possession. Each person took what lay within their reach, then withdrew at the right moment. In many cases, withdrawing early was safer than trying to optimize gain. The custom here was not about fairness, but about minimizing shared risk. And it was the environment, not human intention, that scored each pattern of action. Over time, such sequences became so familiar that they required no thought. When similar situations arose, the body already knew what to do. Not because it remembered a rule, but because the collective memory of near danger still resonated clearly. This is how customs formed, not through speech, not through decisions, but through repeated behaviors that had once allowed the group to cross the narrow boundary between safety and risk. And within these small, nearly invisible customs, humans began to learn something essential. living together does not require explicit laws, but it does require the ability to sense a shared rhythm. The rhythm of the environment and the rhythm of those beside you. Night 2 generated its own subtle customs. No one announced, "At night we must be quiet," yet silence became the norm. Not absolute silence, but selective silence. Unnecessary sounds gradually disappeared. Excess movements were reduced. Children learned through observation to make less noise after dark without being told. The repetition of silence formed a shared habit, a wordless custom with strong binding force. Customs also appeared in how groups separated and rejoined. When a smaller group split off, there was no farewell ritual. But there were familiar signs the pace of movement slowed. Distances gradually increased, eye contact diminished. When groups met again under favorable conditions, merging was equally undramatic, moving together for a stretch, resting in similar places, then naturally staying close for longer. These sequences repeated often enough to become how things happen. Notably, these customs did not require long-term memory. No one remembered the first time they appeared. They were not retold as stories. They existed in the present, activated whenever similar circumstances arose. Thus, customs at this stage were not tradition in a historical sense. They were collective reflexes. Some customs concerned bodily distance. Not everyone stood equally close. Safe distance was adjusted depending on context, closer when protection was needed, farther apart when conflict needed to be avoided. Those who frequently violated appropriate distance experienced reduced closeness, not through reprimand, but by being less included. Children learned this early because bodily distance is a language the body understands before words. Other customs related to timing, when to stop, when to move, when to wait. No one carried a calendar, but the rhythms of day and night fatigue and recovery scarcity and abundance created implicit time windows. The group learned not to move too late when visibility dropped, learned not to exploit resources too deeply when bodies were already exhausted. Those who broke these rhythms tended to increase risk, and such behavior was repeated less often. Gradually, rhythm became custom. Customs also shaped responses to the unfamiliar. When encountering a new sign, a new smell, sound, or track, the common response was not curiosity, but stopping observing and often changing direction. No discussion was required. Repeated avoidance formed a norm. What is not understood should not be approached hastily. This norm was not blind fear. It was a strategy for managing uncertainty. Over time, these nameless customs began to lightly harden, not into laws, but into expectations. When someone acted differently, the difference was immediately felt without judgment, simply as a sense of "this is not right." That feeling did not arise from morality, but from collective memory that such behavior had once led to danger. That memory did not reside in one mind. It was distributed across many bodies and activated simultaneously. Here, the boundary between survival behavior and custom began to blur. A behavior is repeated because it works. A custom is behavior that continues to be repeated even when its effectiveness is no longer consciously evaluated each time. It saves cognitive energy. There is no need to rethink everything from scratch. One simply does what has been done before. In a world where mental energy is as precious as physical energy, this efficiency was a major advantage. Nameless customs also created a sense of familiarity. Familiarity was not belief, it was predictability. Knowing how others would react in a given situation reduced risk. That predictability laid the groundwork for deeper forms of bonding later. But at this stage, it remained practical, knowing in order to avoid collision, to coordinate, to avoid surprise. alongside customs tied directly to daily survival, another layer quietly formed around absence when someone in the group no longer stood up, no longer kept pace, no longer breathed with the others through the night. Death in the world of 1 million years ago was not rare. Yet precisely because it was common, it was not dismissed as meaningless. It left a very concrete gap in the group's fragile structure. When an individual died, the first response was not ritual. It was practical. A body that no longer moved introduced new risk scent, attracting predators' delay when the group needed to move disruption of survival rhythm. But instead of immediately abandoning the body, many groups paused long enough to handle the departure in repeated ways, and that repetition gradually became custom. One of the earliest behaviors was placing the body away from the main flow of activity, not out of abstract reverence, but for safety. The body was dragged away from the primary resting place, sometimes placed in a hollow, a rock crevice, or a sheltered area. Over time, not leaving the dead in the center of daily life became self-evident. No one questioned why. The body simply knew this way the group is safer. In some cases, the body was covered with earthstone's branches or with the very hide that had once been worn. Initially, this was an act of concealment, masking scent, reducing visibility. But repeated often enough, it acquired another tone. The body was not left exposed. Not because of beliefs about souls, but because familiarity with living form made the motionless form difficult to accept when left fully uncovered. Covering reduced direct confrontation with death. These actions were not burial in the later sense. There were no marked graves, no sacred spaces preserved long-term. But there was a familiar sequence: stop handle, cover then leave. This sequence repeated often enough to become how things are done when someone was gone. Notably, groups often did not leave immediately after handling the body. They stayed for a short while, not long enough to form a clear ritual, but long enough for the rhythm of life to slow. Subsequent movement was often quieter, more cautious. No one declared mourning yet. The entire group shifted tempo. That shift was unnamed, but clearly felt. Children in such moments were not told what death was. They observed difference. That person did not stand, did not move, did not respond. They saw adults treat the body differently from other objects, not discarded, not reused, not touched casually. Through this, children learned that some absences require different treatment, not through words, but through collective posture. There were also subtle customs that followed death. Some places associated with the deceased were avoided for a time, not from fear of spirits, but from memory of danger. If someone died in a place by predator accident or exhaustion, that place carried a risk marker. Avoiding it was not superstition. It was learning from loss. But repeated avoidance took on the shape of taboo. In some cases, objects closely associated with the deceased, a familiar tool, a habitual covering, were not reused immediately. Not because of any explicit prohibition, taboo, or belief, but because of a subtle sense of mismatch. These objects had been shaped over time by a particular body, by the angle of a hand, the weight of an arm, the rhythm of repeated movements. A stone tool bore the memory of how it had been struck and held. A hide carried the folds and stretches formed by one person's shoulders and back. Through constant use, object and body had adjusted to one another until they functioned as a single system. When that body disappeared, the system broke. The tool no longer fit in the same way. The covering no longer settled naturally. Using it required small adjustments that the body immediately noticed. The discomfort was not symbolic, it was physical. The object resisted smooth use, and that resistance translated into hesitation. In a world where hesitation increased risk, such friction mattered. Setting the object aside was not an act of remembrance, but of efficiency. It was easier and safer not to force a misaligned tool back into use. There was also a perceptual dimension to this mismatch. Objects tied to a particular person carried a dense cluster of sensory memories: the sight of that person's hands using the tool, the sound of the object moving against their body, the timing of its use within the group's shared rhythm. When another person reached for it, those memories surfaced without words. The object did not feel neutral. It pulled attention away from the present moment toward an absence. That shift in attention, however slight, was dangerous. In an environment that demanded constant awareness, anything that disrupted focus was quietly avoided. Over time, this avoidance became patterned. Objects belonging to the deceased were left where the body had been placed or nearby. Not ceremonially arranged, not offered, simply not taken back into circulation. The sequence was practical and unspoken. A body stops moving. The group adjusts. Certain objects stop moving as well. The chain of actions associated with that person was allowed to end cleanly, without being awkwardly continued by someone else. Repeated often enough across generations, this pattern could solidify into a habit. Leaving objects with the dead was no longer just an individual choice, but an expected outcome. It marked a clear boundary. This set of movements, this combination of body and tool, has ended. The world is slightly simpler when it is not forced to accommodate a broken pairing. In this way, objects became part of how endings were managed, not as symbols of an afterlife, but as closures of functional loops. This practice also reduced uncertainty within the group. When no one immediately reached for a deceased person's tools or coverings, there was no competition, no ambiguity over ownership, no disruption of coordination. The absence was acknowledged through inaction. The group did not need to decide who should take what. The default was to leave things be. In small, mobile groups where conflict was costly, such defaults mattered. Only much later would similar behaviors be reinterpreted as respect mourning or belief in another world. At this stage, they were none of those things. They were solutions to a very specific problem: how to let a sequence of actions end without fraying the fragile coherence of the group. Leaving objects behind was a way of saying without words, without concepts, that something had concluded and that the living needed to move on without dragging broken rhythms with them. In this sense, the earliest acts that resemble burial goods were not gestures toward meaning, but gestures toward stability. They helped the group close one chapter of movement and begin another lighter and more coherent in a world that allowed no space for lingering uncertainty. Customs around death, therefore, did not aim to explain what happened afterward. They did not answer where the person went. They simply helped the group continue without being torn apart by absence. Here, custom functioned as a psychobiological buffer, softening the shock of loss, so the group did not immediately disintegrate. More importantly, these behaviors marked the first time humans treated an event that no longer had direct survival utility, yet still required a shared procedure. Death did not improve hunting speed movement or immediately reduce danger, but handling death helped maintain group stability. And at this point, custom began to move beyond pure survival, touching the edge of ritual. There were no prayers, no gods, no concept of an afterlife, only a very ancient recognition when someone disappears, the group must do something in a familiar way, so the world does not become entirely chaotic. These customs covering avoiding slowing leaving had no names, were not told as stories. Yet they left deep traces in how later humans would face death. From these quiet, practical actions, humans slowly learned to set aside a special space for the end of a life. And perhaps it is here in these nameless customs around death that we most clearly see the moment humans began to differ from all other animals, not because they understood death, but because they could not entirely ignore it. Importantly, no custom was immutable. When the environment changed strongly enough, old customs faded. No reform was needed, no debate. They simply ceased to be repeated. New customs appeared when new behaviors proved more effective. This system was flexible because it was unwritten, unsanctified, and unenforced by power. It lived or died according to its fit with reality. From today's perspective, we can see in these nameless customs the seeds of many things that would come later. Ritual law, morality, religion. But at this stage, they carried no abstract meaning. They were simply ways of acting that allowed tomorrow to arrive before death did. Perhaps most striking of all is this: humanity's earliest customs were not created to connect people to the sacred. They were created to connect people to the harsh reality of the world. Only later, when the world became safer, did humans gain the space to assign those actions meanings beyond survival. The final chapter will look back over this entire journey, not to conclude, but to recognize that many things we consider natural today began with nameless customs etched into the human body 1,000,000 years ago, and still echo in how we live, sleep, dress, and exist together even now. 1,000,000 years ago, no one knew they were doing anything great. No one believed that sharing a small piece of food, sleeping close together on a cold night, returning again and again to the same familiar place, would one day become the foundation of society, morality, and human memory. They were not building a future. They were not leaving messages behind. They did not even know that they would have descendants. And yet every step they took extended our existence, in every reflex to avoid danger, in the unease of living without plans, in the instinctive need for someone nearby when the darkness lasts too long. All of this did not begin with cities, did not begin with civilization, but with people who lived long before history existed. If you are listening to these final moments at night, try to think about this: that the comfort around you is not the natural state of humanity. It is the result of hundreds of thousands of years of continuous survival, unrecorded, uncelebrated. And perhaps the most important thing that 1,000,000 years ago left us was not tools, not intelligence, but something deeply human: the ability to adapt even without knowing what lies ahead. If this story has accompanied you this far, I would love to know: where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a small trace of the present below, just as our ancestors once left their footprints on the earth, never knowing they would still be remembered 1,000,000 years later. Wishing you a quiet night.